All right. So what you're doing for today and what we did the other day is is numerical. This is more algebraic, like we talked about. All right. So we're going to start with now for simplifying using factoring skills. When a problem asks you to simplify, when a problem asks you to simplify, one of the first things we're going to look to do is factor out the GCF. And then we're going to factor like you did polynomials, but using trig functions as variables. All right. So for the first one, sine x cosine squared x minus sine x. All right, you should notice that they both have sine x in them. So we factor that out as if that was a variable, so sine x. Now the result of factoring that out would give us cosine squared x minus 1. Okay. Everybody good with that part of it? All right, now when we come over here, and this is what we're going to be practicing over the next couple of weeks so you get adept to it. You have a Pythagorean identity which will be in front of you whenever you take a quiz. You'll have the identities in front of you. You're not going to have to memorize those. You're just going to have to utilize them. So sine squared u plus cosine squared u equals 1. That means that we can rewrite those as either 1 minus cosine squared u or 1 minus sine squared u. All right. So if you ever see the expression 1 minus either sine squared or cosine squared, then that is equivalent to the opposite. All right. The same, we'll talk on Wednesday about the impact on secant squared and tangent squared. But I just want to go through those today so you have an understanding of that. Does that make sense to everybody? So if you're doing a problem and you see 1 minus cosine squared u, you replace that with sine squared u. Because that simplifies it. It turns it from 2 terms into 1. Now, the next thing is 1 minus sine squared u is the same thing as a negative sine squared u minus 1. All right? When you switch the order in subtraction, you switch the sign. That makes sense. So 1 minus sine squared u is equivalent to negative sine squared u1. Because if we distributed, the negative times that would give us that, and the negative times the negative would turn that into a positive. Well, 1 minus sine squared u we just wrote above was cosine squared u. And then if we wanted to move that negative over, that would be equivalent to sine squared u minus 1. So if instead of 1 minus, it's just the sine squared minus the 1, instead of a positive, it's a negative. Okay? So how that relates to you is this. I see in my problem cosine squared x minus 1. That's the same thing as this. Oops, went too far. But instead of turning that into, that's going to become negative sine squared x. All right? So each one of those steps shows knowledge. That shows factoring out the GCF. That shows understanding identity. And then finally, to simplify, the final answer would be negative sine cubed x. Any issues with any of those steps? Good. And sometimes it's more straightforward. For example, secant squared x minus 1. Your Pythagorean identity says tangent squared x plus 1 equals secant squared x. Well, if I wanted to get that to look like that, the straightforward way is, how would I get rid of the plus 1? Subtract 1. They cancel there, and now I would have tangent squared x equals secant squared x minus 1. Which is the same thing as that secant squared x minus 1. So that means this is equivalent to tangent squared x. And we'll summarize all that because that's the hardest part of this unit. All right? Now, believe it or not, factoring is going to be one of the more straightforward things you do in this unit. Because when it's a factoring problem, you know what you got to do. The hardest thing people have had over the years is trying to figure out what to do. They don't know what their next step is, their first step is. When you see an expression, something squared plus the same trig function and then a constant, that's a quadratic. If this looked like this, 4x squared plus x minus 3, all right? Excuse me 1 second. Okay? So, if I factored this using slide and divide, x squared plus x minus 12, x squared plus x minus 12, which factors into x plus 4, x minus 3. Now, if you're going to do slide and divide, there's your 4. You have to remember to bring that back and put it under your constant. If it goes in evenly, divide. 4 divided by 4 is 1, x plus 1. 4 doesn't go into 3 evenly. You look to reduce that fraction if possible. If not, you simply move it into the coefficient, 4x minus 3. All right? The only difference is it's not an x. What was it? It was tangent. So x is equivalent to tangent of theta. So in your final answer, instead of x, what would be the expression that's the variable? Tangent of theta. Okay? So that's what you're doing. You're doing the 3 on the top real quick. You're doing the 3 on the top real quick.